Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Good afternoon or good evening. It depends because I see that you are joining us from all around the world for our webinar on refugees and migrants in Europe, discrimination and xenophobia during COVID-19. My name is Amanda Figueras, and I am a member of KAICIID's Network for Dialogue, representing Foro Abraham for Interfaith and Interreligious Dialogue based in Spain. I am very honored to be the moderator facilitating this session with our three inspiring speakers. I will let you know more about them just in a moment, but first I would like to provide you some useful information about the house rules for this webinar, which is hosted by the Program for Social Inclusion of People Seeking Refuge of the International Dialogue Center, KAICIID. You have to know that the session is being recorded. So if you would like to go back on some of the ideas discussed today or share the webinar with later on with your fellows or within your community, the webinar will be made available on KAICIID's YouTube channel and also in the website. Please mute your microphone if you haven't done so already, as this will ensure that there is no background noises when our speakers are presenting. This webinar will have three independent contributors, and at the end, our speakers will have a time for addressing your questions and comments. So please do take advantage of this format of the webinar and send in your questions. Even during the presentations, no problem, you can use the button. You can see the button right down next to the chat, the question and answer. Please also take a moment to introduce yourself, to say your name, your country, or your representative organization. Last but not least, as there are still technical challenges all around the world, and we are actually tuning in with from different parts of the globe. If anything is interrupted, please be patient as we are trying to working hard to address all logistical issues. So thanks once more for being here with us. We don't have much more time, so we are going to go to the topic directly. Today, our focus will be on discrimination and xenophobia affecting refugees and migrants in Europe. During this pandemic, we are facing many challenges globally, and this is a symptom of the importance and the urgency of addressing injustice. I will not speak a lot because we all want to listen and to learn from our panelists, but as a brief introduction, we must know that COVID-19 related hate speech has serious implications for minority communities. According to the United Nations, it increases the likelihood that they will be excluded politically and socially. And in extreme situations, it can also trigger violence and atrocity crimes. This webinar will explore possible approaches to combat xenophobia, stigmatization, and exclusion in different European countries. And it will combine insights from academic research and from the grassroots work. So with the refugees and migrants during the pandemic. So we are very happy to have three amazing speakers. All of them have a very important experience, and I think that we all are going to learn a lot. So Francesco, you are going to be our first panelist. So I think that you can try to share your screen if it is possible. Yeah. Meanwhile, I'm going to introduce you our first speaker, Dr. Francesco Fasani. He is an associate professor at the School of Economics and Finance in Queen Mary, University of London. He is a research affiliated at the Center for Economic Policy Research and a research fellow at the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration, and at ISA, Institute for the Study of Labor, which is in Germany, and at Fondazione Rodolfo De Benedetti, which is in Italy. His main research interests are in labor economics, applied microeconometrics, economics of migration, and of crime. He has acted as a consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Organization for Migration, and the World Bank. This is really only a brief summary of his profile, and he was also contributing with some big media, and his researches has been featured in very, very important newspapers. So thank you for being today with us. The title of his presentation is The Vulnerability of Migrants and Refugees in the Pandemic Crisis. You know, you have like around 10 to 15 minutes. So yes, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Amanda, for the very kind introduction. Thank you for KAICIID for the invitation, and everyone for attending this webinar. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm an economist, so we'll give you kind of a little bit of my point of view on which are the consequences of the expected consequences of the pandemic crisis for migrants and refugees based on what we know about them. And so the first, let me start with a simple fact, which is becoming more and more obvious over time, including the US right now. So the pandemic is not treating everyone equal, and is really, on the contrary, is exposing inequalities which were existing in societies, and which were existing within societies and across countries in the world. And all signs that we have suggest that this pandemic will actually increase these inequalities. So we strengthen them, we widen them. And so it's clear, it's becoming more and more clear that pre-existing disparities in the society in all variables such as income or the type of employment status or the ethnicity, the migrant status, the housing condition, the access to welfare, will determine who suffered the most out of this crisis. And unfortunately, but not unsurprisingly, it's really the poorest individual, the poorest countries which we expect to suffer the most. So it's really the already vulnerable groups which will which are already suffering and will suffer the most out of this crisis. Migrants and refugees are a vulnerable group, and really some of that is really, they are kind of relative newcomers in societies, in hosting societies. So for them is just in the labor market, it's just harder to find a job. They're more likely to have temporary contracts, informal arrangements, lower tenure on the jobs, which are all characteristics associated with a higher probability of being laid off or being dismissed once a recession hit the country. So now their job is at risk, together with the fact that they have typically lower wages. They experience lots of skill downgrading, meaning that they are assigned to occupations whose skills are much lower than the skills they have, and this is due to discrimination in the market, language barriers, lack of recognition of their qualifications, and very often they have limited access to welfare state. So they face, so in the current crisis, they face a high risk of losing their jobs, together with having probably lower savings, lower incomes, limited safety net. So this is really a recipe for poverty, for destitution, which is something which is major concern about migrants. Refugees more or less tend to struggle even more than migrants in terms of integration. Let me just show one, well, I've got like 3 graphs, but like a simple graph. This is what we call assimilation profiles for economists. So this just shows how long does it take for a migrant to catch up with the level of employment, with the employment rate of natives in society. And these lines just tell you let's look at the red line is for non-EU migrants in the European Union. And this graph is approaching, this line approaches the 0, which is the level of, let's say, of natives. So it takes a few years, up to 10 years for non-EU migrants to catch up, to reach the level of employment of natives. The green line are refugees this is for European countries. So they start with a very low unemployment rate, and it takes for them 20 years on average, clearly, to catch up with the level that natives have in terms of employment. So they're already weak in the labor market, and this recession, this crisis may make them even weaker. In addition to that, and to this economic impact, which on migrants and refugees will also affect the communities of origin, because which lives of remittances, the migrants and refugees will experience kind of pandemic-specific risk, which has to do with a higher health hazard, which is due for poor housing, crowded conditions at home and on the job place, occupation which have direct contact with customers and the public, and also limited access to healthcare. So higher health hazard, the travel restriction which prevent them from going back home or traveling from home to the work where they usually work, which prevents friends or relatives to travel. This also affects their well-being and in a more broader sense. They face the risk of losing legal status, because if they lose the employment and if the working residence permits apply to being in employment, as it very often happens in Western societies, they may just lose the job together with the legal status. There are lots of very worrying long-term consequences for the children who are losing the school, who are just delaying their integration in the society, and will experience all the mental distress which is associated with losing the job and having income losses which their parents will face. And possibly, which is very much the topic of this discussion, very likely this will lead possibly to increase in discrimination, increase negative attitudes toward them, and increase hate crime against them. So the picture is an existing vulnerability which may become even more salient and even more concerning in the pandemic crisis. But just let me give you like kind of an optimistic view, and this is something I've been working a lot in the last couple of months for the European Commission. Try to, as you know, all countries have classified occupation and sector in essential and non-essential in the middle of the crisis. And an important aspect which is emerging is that, I mean, we all knew that, but I think the broader society and lots of politicians didn't ever think about it, is that migrants are playing a big role in what I call the response to the COVID pandemic, which comes from abroad. So this is some work I've done again for the European Union. So this is just looking at how many migrants are employed in so-called key occupation, the essential occupation in the pandemic crisis. And for the EU 14 plus UK, almost 20%, meaning 1 person out of 5 who is doing a key occupation in this pandemic is a foreign person, which can be either a European in other European countries or extra EU, the red bars. And if you look at some specific occupation, we see that, so this graphic just telling us, again, the share of migrant workers by occupations, again, the EU 14 UK. So some of occupation, the migrants account for 1 out of 5, 1 out of 3, even more. Look at the cleaners and the helpers, stationary plants, laborers in mining, food processing, drivers, personal care workers, personal service workers. So migrants are really playing a major role in this essential occupation in the middle of the pandemic. As you can see, the largest share are in low qualification, so-called low qualification occupations, because for the reason I said before, these skill downgrading migrants tend to be more likely to end up in occupations which are kind of low qualified, even if they have high qualification. So this is a possibility of maybe, just it's an open question for the debate, whether this pandemic will lead to realizing how fundamental migrants are for our society, and even the so-called low-skilled, low-qualification, low-qualified migrants, which in the debate that we always hear is, I mean, the debate about migration policy, if it's, I mean, the positive part of it, there is a very negative one, but there is also a positive part, which is still very much concentrated on high-skilled migrants. We want to attract the best talents, the best brains from the world. But what this pandemic is showing is that people without degrees and without PhDs and masters are actually doing fundamental jobs in our society that we need. And so let's say the possible, the positive element that I want to bring to the discussion is that the possibility that realizing this fundamental role they have, that this pandemic may give an opportunity for realizing this fundamental role that migrants have in the society. And so we all know, I guess everyone who is attending this webinar thinks that altruistic concern and fairness concerns are enough to justify better, an improvement in the treatment we have of migrants and refugees in our society. But but we also know, are very much aware that for lots of politicians, lots of voters, this is not enough. So they don't really, they tend to be hostile to migrants. So maybe are just acting out of pure self-interest, thinking that, realizing that these migrants are here to contribute to the society, may change the discourse. And this is an open question. The evidence we see, and actually the Overseas Development Institute in the UK has done a nice job of mapping initiatives by European governments and governments outside Europe, which have been taken to improve the integration and to reduce the vulnerability of migrants in the middle of the crisis. And there were many of these initiatives, which suggest that somehow there may be a change in political discourse towards a more positive stance. And an example I can give you is that the Italian government decided to grant an amnesty for agricultural workers and personal care workers in Italy. The underlying motivations, in my view, are more related to this self-interest concern. We need people to pick up the fruits and vegetables and to take care of our elderly people. But there is also some discourse on improving the welfare of these individuals. And maybe, so this is maybe a step in the right direction. And let me just conclude with a cartoon, which suggests that maybe is a step in the right direction. Maybe there is an improvement in the discourse, or maybe not. And this is just, I'm translating from Italian. This man in a smart suit, which represents kind of the government or the business sector in Italy, is saying, "I'm granting you the legal status to an agricultural worker, but you will give it back to me once the emergency is over." So this is just I conclude here to summarize my brief intervention, is that refugees and migrants, so the COVID is affecting unequally different groups and different countries, and the most vulnerable ones are more at risk of suffering, both economically and from an health perspective. Migrants and refugees are vulnerable and they will suffer, and maybe there is an opportunity of changing a little bit the discourse, because clearly there is a need for action on refugees and migrants to help them survive and to improve their welfare throughout this major crisis. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for this insightful lecture. Actually, wow, this last slide is very touching, right? And I think that you raised essential topics, starting from how the pandemic that we say that is affecting everyone the same, actually is not, and how it is exposing inequalities across and within countries, right? And moreover, it was very interesting when you when you were talking about if there was an improvement related to the public discourse on migration, and how things might not be as good as it seems at the beginning. So thank you so much for this. I encourage our participants to post their questions in the chat, because this is a unique opportunity to send questions to very specific to people who really knows a lot about what we are talking about. So thank you so much also for being for being time. We are going to proceed now with our second panelist. I'm going to present her. She is Dr. Angela Maria Arbeláez. She is the founder of Art Bridges, a non-profit cultural organization based in Greece. Previously, she taught story of art at several universities in Colombia, and she completed a fellowship at the University of Crete in 1998. In 2012, she was awarded with Marca País, Marca Colombia, which is a prize in honor of being a prominent Colombian citizen working abroad. And in 2015, she received the Premio de las Américas in Israel. Both awards were as a result of her contribution to interfaith and intercultural dialogue. In 2018, she expanded her non-profit organization's activities to the slums, working with Greek Roma suffering extreme poverty in Mytilene in Greece. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing well the name of this city. She's always transmitting how truly passionate it is about her work, and she's really committed to help. And I think that this is one of the keys of her success. Angela, I don't know if you are ready to try to share your screen.
First of all, I want to thank our Network for Dialogue and KAICIID for this invitation to participate in this webinar on timely and important topic. It seems pertinent to start sharing with you what is our Bridges interface in the cultural dialogue, the organization I'm coming from and we create together with my daughter. We acquired legal status in April 2017, but we have been working for almost 2 decades. Our Bridges is a creative learning platform that uses culture, music, the arts, and dialogue as a tool for the well-being, empowerment, social inclusion, and harmony lives of those most vulnerable. After having reached more than 9,000 children and young forced migrant young mothers, we also extended our work to the slums where the Greek Romani people live in conditions of extreme poverty, isolated and excluded from the society here on the island of Lesbos. Through intercultural dialogue, we have managed to unite all them. Our violins managed to brighten the lives of thousands of children who came from the war, sometimes disfigured. As every citizen of the world, this is my thinking, our dream is to see, to draw on the face of each child of our cosmos, our world, a big, very big smile where well-being, love, and peace surround, embrace all them, regardless of their ethnic origin or faith. Art is a powerful advocacy tool to communicate stories and also can provide a vehicle, a way for self-development and personal expression. Art provides a platform to raise awareness and encourage displaced persons to realize their own potential. It also has been an undeniable cathartic and healing value. However, by working in the field, our work extends if there is a need to be mediators, spokespersons, and promoters of the rights of refugee and advocacy. The COVID-19 pandemic undoubtedly represents a challenge and change for us. For 2 months, our communication with children and young people was made through blank chat, overcoming difficulties in accessing the network or the lack of a table or phone by them. Our support became virtual and our access as well as the many non-formal education organizations working on Lesbos was limited or forbidden because of the field, so we have to stop. Before continuing, it is important to share with you some statistical information that you can see now on the screen in our PowerPoint. We have to remind you that we have increased until now around 2,900 reported cases of COVID-19, 1,375 people, 76 people have recovered. We have unfortunately 176 people who died, and the total population of Greece in this context is around 10,070,000. We have a population of refugees, of migrants around 65,000, 75,000. The sources are different from UNHCR and from the government, but I think it's around 70,000 people, asylum seekers and refugees living currently all around Greece inside camps or in accommodation. So we are talking about Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Kos, Leros, Rhodos, and Tilos. On Lesbos, we have in this moment we are recording this video 80,700 people 10,000 of them are living in very bad conditions outside Moria in a modern favela. Around 1,250 persons were living in a Karatepe municipality camp for refugees and migrants. The government and the local authorities have also created three small emergency place to host people arriving from the shores of Turkey. This one is in Therma, in the north of the island. They live in tents. They are provided with minimal needs for life. There is also an isolation place where people with COVID-19, infected with COVID-19, are living inside of a tent, isolated from the rest of the fellows. And we have a non-formal place in the port of Mytilene city, where around 80 people are living in the bus, I think around now 1 month, in not good conditions, of course. Another challenge of these situations, of course, are the tensions and violence within the community, the refugee community inside of Moria camp is increasing very big. Till now, according to the police report, official information, we have about 4 dead persons from the 1st of January. The last one was a week ago, a young woman who was confronting with another woman, and both of the mothers, one of them passed away. We have robbing, we have assaulting inside the community and sometimes outside in the surrounded village. This is they are living in an overcrowded camp, and the situation become very difficult, not only for them, also for local population and people living close to them. And this is that living in a state of agony, because I think this is exactly what we have to use, of not knowing what the next day has in store for them. It's not an easy thing for any one of the people involved in this. But the challenge must be assumed, adapted. In this way, amid the chaos generated by the new norm of social distance, a small organization like we, like everyone here, had to adapt quickly to the common good of the refugees and everyone in need. Having preceded in the previous months, as you may have read or listened, a witch hunt against no governmental organizations and state force, the pandemic in the case of Lesbos favored the discrimination rhetoric that prevailed in the days before for the refugees and humanitarian activists. Violent attacks on volunteers and temporary shelter centers were hopefully left finally behind. Communities of asylum seekers play a very important and positive role in this case. They organize and create movements such as Corona Moria Awareness Team to face the corona crisis. Teachers, pharmacists, other professionals, house women from many nationalities, from many faiths, who arrived to Lesbos from the shores of Turkey, united to avoid COVID-19 to reach the camp. Their team raised awareness and carried out many other activities, including cleaning the surroundings of the camp. Lucky, not case till now that we are recording, are registered till now in a Moria site. Now, another project, Safe Hands. Another example worth noting is that of grassroots organizations like Starfish, who is providing a wide range of services inside Moria camp. Along with the rest of the world, on Lesbos, received a great deal of advice about how to combat coronavirus, social distancing, staying at home, washing our hands many times per day. But think about, if you were one of the nearly 80,000 people living in the overcrowded refugee camp at Moria, all of those things were impossible. Overcrowding, the need to stand for many hours in a huge line for food, and not reliable source of water made those simple health messages virtually useless. There was one thing that our bridges partner in our Greek Romani project, Assis Starfish Foundation, thought they could do. Provide the people with simple hand washing facilities. Soap and water has been proven a powerful and effective way to counter the virus. Within a matter of days, Starfleet established 4 very basic hand washing stations around the registration identification center in Moria. Repurposed olive oil barrels, kitchen stools, and bucket, as well as a copious supply of soap and water, is all it took. Manned by asylum seekers themselves, the wash stations are now catering for an estimated 5,000 pairs of hands a day, and they have planned to expand the program even further. It is important also to notice that the Starfish resident volunteers are now not only giving the people a chance to wash their hands, but all becoming powerful advocates for disease prevention, all being trained in public health and hygienic messaging. This is a program that the Starfish Foundation intends to continue until we are all safe from COVID-19. And the truth is that it seems to be a long way till it's finished. It is important also here to emphasize that with Starfish, we are Bridges Jeffries Techniques. We are going to implement this program in the slums where the Greek Romani people live without access to drinking water or electricity in Pagani area, in Mytilene and in Gera. And what about the media is another thing that we have to raise, we are supposed to raise in this webinar. So the negative media presence in recent weeks, attacking many of the large NGO, now highlighted the voluntary actions of Moria camp residents without hiding the difficult living conditions for more than 10,000 refugees living outside the walls of Moria in a very gigantic favela in the heart of Europe. I would dare to say that in this case, the pandemic calmed, silent the attacks of xenophobia. While it is true that vulnerable population groups as Romani, Greeks, and refugees were stigmatized one more time, the pandemic united the majority. In Moria, after years of requesting it, 2 small government emergency medical centers were finally opened. The pandemic, as I may say mentioned before, is an holistic phenomenon that concerns every one of us and everyone without discrimination in ethnic, race, or religion. And it is here that we must say that one of the successful way of avoiding xenophobic and discriminatory reactions is that every action that is taken is carried in favor of the population of refugees, newcomers, but also it should be always applied, even if it's in a very smaller scale, to the local population. A characteristic that the interventions of humanitarian organizations are seen in a positive or neutral way when a part of their intervention also is in favor of their local population. We must make use always of the dialogue, the exchange of experience, and always take into account all those involved, never leaving someone outside of this. Now coming back to our Bridges Jeffries Techniques, In our emergency production of fabric masks, we combine the skills of the Afghan dressmakers with the fantasy of Greek Roman girls. Of the 2,000 masks manufactured, we almost are going to finish, 1,000 will be delivered to the hospital and local population. 1,000 will be distributed by community leaders in Karatepe and Moria camp or whoever is needed. Being a self-financed and local NGO organization gives us the possibility to add directly. It is the truth that the economic resources are almost null, but in return, the ideas invoked and interventions have an immediate effect on the quality of life of our fellow citizens. Now we are back to our activities, slowly, to our children and youth. This time, of course, without hugs, without handshaking, maintaining the obligatory social distance of about 1.5 meters inside of a container. That is quite a challenge. Firmly believing in the strength of dialogue and culture as a vehicle for social cohesion, harmony, love, and peace for everyone. I may thank you and our bridges again you for your attention, as well as KAICIID for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Our bridges, as one of the founded members of the KAICIID Network for Dialogue, remains committed to promote dialogue, both interfaith and intercultural, and build bridges across culture. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, dear Angela. Even though we have you on the video, it was very interesting to listen. Yeah, we have you in the video and there, but the sound unfortunately is not very good. Thank you so much for taking the effort to record this video. I just want to say something before. Please do take advantage of the format of the webinar, and please post your questions in the chat. In the chat that you have down in your screen. I would like to congratulate you for your work and how interesting it is that you are showing how to bring people together can make very big changes. Thank you for showing us this great case experience that you have. I like a lot how you explain about the power of art, of bringing people together and to break stereotypes. Your work, if we can say as an example of a micro level experience, it is very necessary and inspiring. It tells us how bringing different people together, giving them a space to interact, and especially working with children. By doing so, we can contribute to combat prejudice, hate speech, and discrimination, and so on. So thank you so much. And also, yeah, it's very touching how you describe the challenging situation that these people is having there, actually. Thank you so much. Now we are going to proceed with our last speaker, Mohsin Mohiuddin. He's an artist, an activist, and a founder of MIWI International, a global nonprofit that builds communication and storytelling interventions for psychological well-being, leadership development, and community engagement. His work has received honors from Solve MIT and Open IDEO. Mohsin's innovative work has reached thousands of people across the world and across more than 12 countries, beginning with his Fulbright scholarship in 2010. He has been a featured speaker at the World Economic Forum, United Nations, MIT, TEDx, and his work on MIWI Syria has been published on the UNHCR Innovation, Vice, and Al Jazeera. Maxine is focused on the power of words and how words can make real changes. One of the persons that who had an impact on his life was Muhammad Ali. And I hope that you could explain this a little bit while talking about your organization. Yes, you can, Mohsin, if you want, you can try to prepare. You are ready for your video. He has a presentation. The name is Lessons and Approaches to Community-Led Communications Interventions for Healing, Leadership Development, and Community Engagement. So thank you so much, and thank you for your patience being the last speaker today. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Amanda and Francesco and Angela. It's an honor to be on a panel with you all. I learned a lot. I think before I go into my my talk, I just wanted to play just a 3-minute video that gives a frame for the work that I do in innovating communications interventions for psychological well-being and social change. So I'm just going to share my screen right now. I think stories are omnipresent. You could be walking down a street and you know there's a story being told somewhere. And because stories are across all cultures, across all time, human beings are living, breathing stories of change. My name is Mohsin Mohiuddin. I'm 34 years old and I'm the founder and CEO of MIWI International. MIWI is working with Syrian refugees in Zatar refugee camp and Azraq refugee camp in Jordan. We're also working with a community of Syrian refugees across 8 cities in Turkey and Lebanon. And we're also working with migrant families and migrant youth in Honduras and Mexico. We have cultivated a community of practice in this innovative methodology for the people, by the people. MIWI is co-owned with the brothers and sisters across these 5 countries. People we work with have suffered extreme violence, inequality, discrimination. Those events risked arresting how they viewed themselves, limiting the types of choices they could make, the goals they could set, the relationships that they could rebuild. In doing this work, you see this transformation where they have a breakthrough and they find the things in their life more meaningful than the pain.
نحن ساعدني أشوف وجهات نظر أخرى وأشوف وجهة نظري كمان. هلأ أنا قادر أكتشف وجهات أخرى للعالم من حولي.
MIWI International is a methodology that uses communication skills building and narrative interventions as tools for psychological well-being, leadership development, and community building. My words that I tell myself can either hurt me or support me. I know words impact our bodies, our breathing, our feelings. This is the power of stories, of communication. For us, communications and storytelling is a vehicle for healing. And then once it's a vehicle for healing, it can become a catalyst for social change led by the brothers and sisters from these disadvantaged, marginalized communities.
راكب بطيء تمام بس هذا التنفس بيساعده انه شو يسيطر ونعيد التحكم ونفكر ونستنتج ونحلل تمام.
هدفي للمستقبل اني اصير فنان مشهور في الوطن العربي وبرين.
MIWI me ayudó a pensar en mi futuro y ahora yo sé que es mi futuro y tengo esperanza. Me da ganas de hacer muchas cosas.
We tell them that even though the world is failing you, you will not fail this world.
نحن وقف اليأس من خلال بناء الأمل. لما نحكي بنرتاح.
I think MIWI is setting the foundation to eradicate the inequality of narratives that exists in the world. And it's this inequality of narratives that feeds into policy, it feeds into education systems, it feeds into culture, and it threatens the collective humanity to which we all equally belong. And as long as we're not exercising this human right to communicate, and as long as communities remain disconnected to their human right to communicate, nothing's gonna get better. So that's just what I've dedicated my life to, and it's my life's purpose, is to see this thing through.
Thank you, Moxie. Now you can go ahead.
All right, great. So just building off of that video, by the way, all the brothers and sisters that you saw in those videos, they were Syrian refugees in the refugee camps leading our program. And I think this is an approach that needs to be expanded upon throughout our respective approaches, is that to create opportunities for the brothers and sisters within those communities to actually lead the program themselves, to customize it and lead it themselves, because the impacts are way deeper, especially when we're talking about impacts for emotional regulation and goal setting and community engagement. If it's led by people from within the community, you're gonna do way better. So the heroes that you saw in those videos, in that video, they're leading our program. We are right now about to start a field study in Zaatari refugee camp to get more quantitative data on how these narrative therapy and communication skills interventions correlate to greater emotion regulation, pro-social relationships, self-esteem, things associated with resilience and psychological well-being. But we do know in 10 years of doing this work, the impacts that are happening now. And we've reached more than 3,000 people across more than 12 countries. Emotion regulation is the biggest one that we're noticing with participants. By engaging them in a process of internal communication, interpersonal communication, and public communication, they're practicing how to regulate their emotions within the process of communication. So we combine controlled breathing, mindfulness exercises with neuroeducation, understanding how your brain talks to your body, especially in situations of stress and fear. And then we combine that with narrative therapy exercises where they're connecting their mind and their heart with their hands in writing and in their breath and their voice and oral speaking and video blogging. So emotion regulation is the biggest piece that we're seeing in terms of impact points. The second one is relationship building and perspective taking. As Dr. Bessel van der Kolk often says, healing is not possible in isolation. But when you create spaces for healthy communication to happen, especially within communities that are fragmented, such as the refugee communities and forcibly displaced and migrants, the ability to exercise the muscles for pro-social relationship building and perspective taking is essential, because perspective taking for our human race is essential for the survival of our human species. And perspective taking, as we know, is associated with cognitive empathy, right? So the other impact point that's important, I think, is goal setting. We know, and research is showing that in situations of chronic stress and fear, the ability for a person to set goals, however big or small, becomes severely diminished. Because in situations of chronic stress and fear, we physiologically change. Our heart rates change, the way our brain operates changes, and it becomes that much harder to set goals. And I think goal setting is an essential component for healthy communication that we're noticing our program is having positive impacts in people's ability to set goals again. So that field study that we're going to do is going to give more quantitative data to those points, but a lot of the things we're seeing in our focus group discussions and internal quantitative data is showing those impact points, which I think is really essential, because oftentimes we think of communication and art as these soft, fluffy things. They're actually not. Communication is directly correlated with our physiology, with our mental health, especially in times like these, in times of COVID, especially in times like these of political polarization and racial and ethnic discrimination that we're seeing across the world, including in my own country where I currently am in America. We're dealing with this. COVID has really impacted how we operate our work. The magic of what we do is it's being in the same room or tent or caravan as the people that we're working with. Because as Francesco pointed out, refugees and migrants are the most vulnerable and most at risk from the pandemic. We've had to completely adapt and change how we do our work. Now, this exposes other inequalities. A lot of NGOs and organizations are quickly jumping to doing things virtually. Okay, great, but not everyone can afford a laptop. Not everyone can afford a phone. Not everyone can afford the minutes to even call in for a mobile intervention or application. So these things are being exposed. We're navigating those very carefully in Honduras, Mexico, Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, where we're currently operating. The other point is that not every service or intervention should be virtual. Not every mental health, psychosocial support application or tool should be virtualized. It can be actually quite irresponsible and dangerous. So we at MiWi International have been trying to move very slowly and with purpose and diligence to not quickly react to what everyone else is doing, so that we, because the people leading our programs are the ones who are refugees. The people leading our programs are themselves migrants. The people leading our programs are themselves survivors of violence and abuse and discrimination. So we have to be very careful with that. One of the things that we're learning right now in the work that we're doing globally is how space is currency. Space is currency. If you don't have space, you're not able to socially distance. If you don't have space, you're not able to work and take care of your kids at the same time. That's one thing we're learning. The second thing we're learning is there's a higher incidence of domestic abuse and domestic violence. It's being attributed to isolation and quarantining and lack of the currency of space, which is connected to inequality. It's connected to economic inequality, inequality in human rights, as Francesca was saying earlier. The other aspect of it is parenting. I think when we talk about supporting those vulnerable and disenfranchised communities, we often talk about the youth, but there's an ecosystem around the youth that holds the youth up. And part of that ecosystem is parents, is mothers and fathers. And in the work that we're doing in listening to our communities that we're honored to serve, we're hearing this growing anxiety and challenge and stress coming from, you already have a baseline of dealing with discrimination and the inequalities and threats of being a refugee or migrant. But then on top of that, the space has become much more constricted. So as a parent, you have a whole host of stresses and challenges there that exacerbates and worsens the threats and impacts on mental health and behavior and decision making. I quickly want to shift to language. We're on this panel talking about racism and xenophobia and discrimination, and thank you, KAICIID, for even doing this in such a timely way. Language is what we use for communication. And language is what we use to give birth to narratives, right? Okay, so what? Why are we even talking about this right now? Narratives and language and communication, it's a tool for our human species to either compete or cooperate, right? As the scholar Brian Boyd writes about in his book, The Origin of Stories, right? Communication, language, and narratives is our tool for, as a human species, to either compete or cooperate. And it gives form and representation to events, right? So in our early forms of communication, when we had a communications revolution as a human species, tens of thousands of years ago, the survival and motivation for communications depended on imitation, just imitating each other. And we now know through neuroscience that, oh, there's a reason why, because we have mirror neurons in our brain that's helping us to imitate and mimic what things are happening around us. But as our brain grew and as we evolved as a human species, our brain suddenly turned into a time machine. It suddenly turned into an operating system for making decisions and then remodeling what we process internally to reimagine and remodel the external world around us, right? But again, there is this constant tension and friction of, as a human species, we either are utilizing this tool of communications to compete or cooperate. And that's tied to our need as a human species to reproduce and to survive, right? Look at the narratives, the dominant narratives around refugees, migrants, and vulnerable people. Is it a narrative of cooperation or is it a narrative of competition? And in most cases, you'll see, especially in countries right now that are dealing with an influx of refugees and migrants, and there's a great fear around it, and political shifts that are happening in the world right now, you see it's more competitive. Those people are taking our jobs. We're paying out of our taxes to support those people. Those people are constantly helpless and need blah, 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 blah. There's a dominant narrative being told here. And I think something that we ignore is when we talk about inequality, especially in the time of COVID. COVID is, as we speak, without our permission, rewriting the story and narrative of our human species. Okay? And one of the things that it's doing is it's writing a narrative that is exposing perhaps to more people the inequalities that have always existed. We typically talk about inequality in economics, inequality in health. There's an inequality in narratives. There's an inequality in stories that feeds into and enables these systems of inequalities, such as economics and health. The inequalities in narratives, it feeds into these social systems. It allows them to exist, right? When we talk about language, then we have to talk about how language is connected to systemic inequality, especially in the time of COVID. And in the time of COVID, communication and language is being weaponized. It is being weaponized across the world to ensure that the inequality in narratives culturally fuels the normalization of systemic inequalities. It's very, very dangerous. I'm going to end in just 1 minute here because I know we want to take time for questions. In the United States, African Americans face disproportionately amount of trauma and violence. The American Medical Association, recently put out a report that says over the course of a Black person's life in America, chronic stress and higher rates of comorbidities reduces the life expectancy of African Americans in this country. Racism and discrimination lead to depression, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and death. All right, this is not me saying this, this is scientists and doctors saying this. Racism is a public health issue. Xenophobia is a public health issue. Discrimination is a public health issue, okay? And COVID is telling us this narrative today, right? Who are the most at risk? Refugees, migrants, indigenous communities. In Germany, we saw outbreaks happening in the centers where asylum seekers are crowded together. That's not just in Germany. In the United States, Black people are dying at a higher rate than the rest of the community in America from COVID. Why is that? It's because of these inequalities. And indigenous communities, right? The Navajo Nation is now surpassing New York State as having the highest number of infections in the United States. So you see it across the board. One thing I want to leave us with, and this is an important point. When we talk about refugees and migrants, we have them as vulnerable. We have them as disenfranchised, as marginalized. This is true. This is one element of the narrative. None of us as individuals or as communities are one story or one narrative. We are myriad stories inside of us, okay? What am I trying to say here? These communities that we're talking about today, they are also our teachers, our knowledge bearers who have been navigating and enduring inequalities, lack of mobility, lack of healthcare, lack of support for economic support. They have been dealing with this for decades. So as much as they are survivors and marginalized and vulnerable, they are also our teachers in this moment. And we need to reframe and approach them as such. We need to give them platforms, and the media in particular needs to approach these communities as today's saviors, as testaments to humanity who have already endured disruption on a mass scale before COVID ever happened. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohsin, for this this reminding about how crucial it is that the refugees and the migrants, they take the ownership of their own narratives. and how the story that that you tell about yourself shapes how you treat yourself, and how you treat yourself shapes how you engage with the people on the planet. This is something that you said before. I like a lot also, and I think this is very interesting and very important and crucial, this that you were explaining about competing or helping, right, with the narratives and the language. And yeah, it's very I think it's a reminder for all of us that we have to take many lessons from them. And this is also from your experience, in order to don't forget to ensure all perspectives are on the scene as well. And
Yeah.
we have to we yeah, we have to take notes about this also.
In that line, if there's time later, we asked Syrian refugees in Germany for this panel to give us just short answers that I can read out later as to how they're dealing with COVID and how they think the host communities are treating them in this moment. Just to give voice to what they're sharing with us. If there's a few minutes later, that would be great to share to this group.
Yes, this is very challenging all the time. How to have all the voices included, and yeah, this is challenging for everyone. And okay, for having the time for being on time, we have many questions in the chat, and I think that I'm going to start with one question that it is addressing. It is to you, Maxime, because you are just talking about this, and I think that you can just finalize your speech answering one question here, and then I'm going to open and go more to the webinar altogether. So we have here a question from Jelena. She's saying that, can you give me an example of what kind of psychological methodology in your activity you are using? And she said that I like an idea of refugees and migrants to be part of the projects as a leaders. They are really heroes. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a psychological pedagogy embedded within every exercise in our program. So one key element that's embedded in every intervention in our program is mindfulness and breathing, actually teaching them how to practice controlled breathing, and situations where controlled breathing can actually slow their heart rate, change their bodies, and navigate certain challenges. The second piece within the methodology in every exercise is we have neuroeducation. There's a lot of research that shows teaching people how the brain communicates with the body in situations of stress and fear actually increases their ability to regulate their emotions, because they understand how their own internal technology works. So this concept of neuroeducation and embedding it within every exercise is extremely important. The other aspect is narrative therapy. A lot of our exercises incorporate narrative therapy, where participants are able to have cognitive distance from the issue or the topic and actually approach it with new perspectives and angles and write about it. And what happens when you have a third object or character in your narrative therapy exercise is you end up writing pieces of yourself into that narrative, just naturally. That's what happens to most of those participants. Then there's a process of interpersonal sharing, where we're encouraging pro-social relationships, the exercising of active listening and perspective taking, which is part of our psychological pedagogy, where you hear others' perspectives, you practice empathy and perspective taking, and then you use that to reframe the stories that you had already started writing. And then the third piece is oral speaking, public speaking, and video blogging. So we're giving them interactive ways to give visibility and to release the stories inside of them. The stories focus very much on goal setting. So that's a key component of the work that we do, because, as I mentioned earlier, chronic stress and fear diminish one's ability to set goals, however big or small. So we don't talk about stories in general. This is not a program for stories. This is specific types of communications exercises and specific types of narratives that promote overcoming challenges, that promote internal problem solving, that promote goal setting and perspective taking and social change. So programs that do storytelling in a general way, that's great, but they need to be more focused. The last thing I'll say is we've done a literature review arts therapies for communities that are dealing with depression and PTSD and suicide with our partner Beyond Conflict, which is a neuroscience lab based in Boston in the United States. And we're finding that arts therapies amplify the psychological well-being kind of impacts of participants that are already going through some clinical type of therapy. So we know that on their own, we don't know yet if on their own arts therapies do that, but we do know that for participants already undergoing some type of clinical therapy, if you combine that with these different types of arts therapies, it enhances the positive impact from those interventions.
Thank you so much, Mohsin. Thank you. And Angela, it is a pity that you cannot like speak, but you have a question there in the chat, so you can type the answer, please. And I'm going to, there is also a question I want to send to Francesco. He was answering some of your questions, also writing. But yes, I wanted to know, there is a question from Johannes Langer. He's saying, how do you see COVID-19 situation for refugees in Europe after the pandemic? Will anything change? And this has another part, which is the second question. Refugees face so many challenges at the pandemic, and the pandemic has made them then that even worse, the situation. Yeah, so he's saying, however, are there any opportunities as well for refugees and their host communities to better connect thanks to COVID-19? So I think there are these two questions. If you may, Francesco, kindly answer.
Yes, well, these are, I mean, a great question. I would love to know the answer, and just, yeah, clearly, as I think these are really open questions. So I think that there are some signs of some kinds of positive signs, so that it may. So as you said, so in terms of like exposure to risk and economic uncertainty and for instance, as she was pointing, like the mental distress which comes from all this increased uncertainty, this is all can hardly be positive for refugees and migrants in general. So this is going to worsen. And then my feeling is that there is an increase, a little bit of shift in perspective. So maybe there is a little bit more concern about the well-being of people and of migrants and refugees in this moment of time, and which comes after. I mean, we were still, I think, at least in some countries like Italy, which I know very well, still talking about a lot about kind of this negative discourse, negative narratives about undocumented migrants coming to Italy, refugees, and which has been, at least, I mean, the media attention, this type of discourse has decreased a lot. And this maybe is a positive sign. So in Italy, like the main politicians who was like pushing for this kind of very anti-immigrant, anti-refugees discourse has lost lots of support in which, at least according to the polls. And this could be a positive sign, for instance, of a country which is maybe shifting the narrative towards a more positive one. And also recognizing that, yeah, we shouldn't always talk about migrants and refugees as an emergency, because there may be much bigger emergencies like the pandemic one. And whether this will translate at the end of all this COVID emergency into better policy making, more inclusive society, this is very much an open question, which is also, I guess, is our role to try to shape the debate in the direction to affect it.
Thank you so much. I think that I see a comment of Julia asking Mohsin for more information about his work, especially in Honduras and Mexico. At the end of the webinar, I will try to post here a slide with the emails of the panelists, and also you can find them in the social media and the website. I mean, it will not be very difficult to find information. We don't have much time, but we want to really allow Mohsin to read those comments that you were saying that you have from your from refugees and migrants and the persons that you are working with. So maybe I can give you like 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and then
Sure.
after that, I will just like close the webinar, and I remind you that this will be posted on the website and the YouTube channel. So go ahead, please. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Amanda, for that. So a Syrian refugee leader of our work in Germany shared this. Before the pandemic, I used to spend my time planning what I should do in my life. I had a plan where I knew exactly my next steps in life. I used to be super organized, and I used to keep all my paperwork and study in a safe place that my daughters can't find. I used to be a multitasker. I used to be calm and confident and have my own space and time before coronavirus. After the pandemic, I lost my private time and space. Now I'm spending my whole days with my kids and don't have time to myself or to continue working on my plan. Now my time is not for me anymore. She goes on to say that before and after the pandemic, part of the German people, not all of them, need to keep in mind that when they are dealing with people, they need to treat them as people that have their own thoughts and beliefs and not focus only on religion or nationality. Being a Muslim woman is not meaning that I'm an extremist. I want the German community to accept me as part of it and consider me as another color from this colorful community. I wish they can accept my existence in their map until everything goes back to normal in my country of Syria. And the last thing I'll say is another participant goes on to say about what she hopes policymakers will do. Her name is Zoza, and she says she's Syrian. I hope that we will focus more on the psychosocial well-being and psychosocial support, not only for the refugee, but for everyone that needs this support right now. I also hope that the organizations and the governments put more effort into the selection process and choosing the right people in places to incorporate people in their communities that do no harm to others. I hope everyone survives this corona pandemic soon, and please trust us and treat us normally.
Thank you so much for this, Mohsin. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your knowledge and for all what we have learned from you. Francesco was focused on the vulnerability of migrants and refugees in the pandemic crisis. Angela was explaining us about an approach to combat prejudice by using art and bringing people together, as she is doing in Greece. And Maxine told us about the power of words and how important it is that those vulnerable take the ownership of their narratives. So thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your time and your effort. We really, really appreciate this from the Network for Dialogue and from the KAICIID, the International Center. Many thanks to our three fantastic speakers, and I wish you, I'm going to start to stop sharing my screen so we can see you one last time. Thank you so much. We are going to say bye now. Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Amanda, thank you all.